Thank you, Ajit. I think your introduction was overextensive. Uh, I must congratulate ADR for organizing this webinar on a very, very important issue of political funding. I must also say that I benefited greatly from hearing the views of Kushbu as well as Rajiv Gowda ji. So let me start by saying why one of the major reasons why the role of money has become so critical in elections today is because we have what is called first past the post at two levels in our system of electoral democracy. First, when we elect our candidates, the candidate who gets the largest number of votes, even if they are only 25% votes, becomes the sole representative of that constituency, even if all the other candidates put together have got more than 3 times as many votes as he has got, so long as no other candidate has got more votes than him or her. Secondly, when the government is formed, the party or the coalition which has a majority, gets the whole government, and the opposition counts for nothing in the running of the government. Therefore, when people vote, they are not merely voting for a candidate, they are also voting for a government. And they don't want to waste their votes. So they don't always vote for the candidate or the party that they consider to be the best if they feel that that candidate has no chance of winning or that party has no chance of forming the government. And therefore, they assess who are the parties who have some chance of coming into government or who are the candidates who have some chance of winning. And among those, they select the least bad among them. And this assessment of which candidate or party has some chance of winning is made largely on the basis of their visibility. And visibility is largely a function of the money that you spend in your elections, because with money you can have advertising, newspapers, electronic media, hoardings, posters. With money, you can also hire campaign workers who carry your hoardings and posters all over, distribute your handbills. With money, you can even organize large election rallies today, which creates this aura and impression that you are in the race. So that is why the role of money has become so important in elections. And therefore, one of the things that we need to do if we want to reduce the role of money in elections is what I consider to be proportional representation. Because in that, if a party gets 5% of the vote, it still gets 5% of the seats. And therefore, you can still vote for the party or the candidate that you consider the best, because even in a proportional representation system, you can have a two-layered system whereby you cast one vote for your favorite party and one more vote for your favorite candidate within that party. So it's not that the top 5% of that party list get elected, but the top 5% who get the maximum number of individual votes within that party will get elected if that party secures 5% of the votes. So that is one reform that I feel needs to be made. Now, we have tried to limit the role of money in elections by placing a limit on the expenditure by candidates. Currently, it's about 75 lakhs in the Lok Sabha, etc. Of course, the smaller candidates from smaller political parties don't even have that 75 lakhs. And that is why the point made by Professor Gowda that we need state funding of elections becomes very important. And the formula that he suggested, 100 rupees per vote that you get, which means that a candidate who secures even 1 lakh votes will get a crore, at least returned back. He can take a loan and fight the elections, but he'll get that money when after the elections. And with 100 rupees per vote, the total public expenditure on the Lok Sabha elections, suppose 100 crore votes are cast, 100 crore votes are not cast, say 60 crore votes are cast, it's just 6,000 crores, which is minuscule compared to this figure that he mentioned of 60,000 crores being spent. It's just 10% of what is actually being spent on Lok Sabha elections in India. So that's one reform which certainly needs to be made. But the other thing is that though there is a limit on the spending by candidates, it's not enforced, as Khushbu was pointing out. There is no system of enforcing this limit. The Election Commission is hardly ever able to catch. We know that people spend, 75 lakhs. They are often spending even more than 10 crores. And even they are not caught because they give a false return of election expenses, because they spend all the money in cash, or third parties spend for them, or political parties spend for them, and therefore they are never caught. Unfortunately, though there is a limit on individual candidates, there is no limit on spending by political parties. In fact, earlier the law said that if a political party spends money for you and you have tacitly uh, accepted that expenditure by the political party, it will count for your election expenses. But even that law has been amended, and now political party spending by political party is not counted into the candidate's expenditure. And as I said, there is no limit on spending by political parties. And as Rajiv Gowda pointed out, the BJP reportedly spent 25,000 crores or something like that in the last Lok Sabha elections, which makes a mockery of this limit of 75 lakhs per candidate, because if they had 500 candidates, they ought to have spent, the total expenditure by all their candidates would not even have been 500 crores. But instead of that, if they have spent 25,000 crores, that's humongous, humongous. So therefore, therefore that makes a mockery. And therefore, one of the reforms that we need to have is to have a limit on spending by political parties. Now, the next question is, how do you enforce this? Well, there are several ways. One is to have complete transparency, put parties under RTI, enforce proactive transparency in the accounts of political parties and the candidates by having a law which forces them to put everything out in the public domain within a month. But more important than that, to ensure that at least political parties and candidates spend everything and take everything. That is, all their income and expenditure must be through bank channels. When this demonetization was brought in, the Prime Minister said that one of the objects of this is to have a cashless society. Now, individuals cannot be, poor people in the country cannot be expected to have all their transactions through banks, but certainly political parties and political candidates contesting elections can be mandated to have all transactions through banking channels. And if they don't, that should be considered to be a corrupt practice, which renders them liable for disqualification. So therefore, that will be a major step towards enforcing these limits on election expenditure. Now, instead of making these kind of changes in our election laws, this government particularly brought in three very retrograde changes. One has already been discussed, that is these anonymous electoral bonds, which, as Professor Gowda pointed out, have gone largely to the ruling party, and mostly we can expect that a lot of them would be in the nature of kickbacks for contracts being given to those corporations. Second retrograde change was to allow unlimited corporate funding. Khushbu pointed out that in some countries they have, in Brazil, I believe, or some South American country, I think Brazil, they have banned corporate funding. I think the Supreme Court of Brazil said corporations are not people, and therefore they cannot be funding political parties. But even if you don't ban them, the earlier law was that no corporation could give more than 15% of their net profit as political funding to political parties. But today, that limit has been completely abolished, with the result that corporations can give even more than what they earn by way of donations to political parties. The third retrograde change was to allow foreign funding. You see, we had gone to court. In fact, I think ADR was the petitioner in that, uh, uh, against the foreign funds received by the Congress party and the BJP. And we got an order from the High Court saying that yes, they have received foreign funding, they should be proceeded against. Now the matter went to the Supreme Court, and in between, that law was amended, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, in order to say that, well, uh, funds received from subsidiaries of foreign companies which are registered in India will not be considered to be foreign funds. The whole object of the FCRA was to prevent public servants, political parties, and candidates from being influenced by foreign funds, and thereby it was to stop them. Now the whole thing has been turned around by allowing, for example, if this Rafael wants to give a kickback to, or this Dassault wants to give a kickback to the BJP for this Rafael contract, all that they have to do is to give that money through a subsidiary. And if they do it through electoral bonds, then it remains anonymous. So these are very, very retrograde changes that have been made. So, in my view, the solutions are at several levels. One is to ensure complete transparency of the finances of political parties and candidates by law. The law should provide that every candidate and political party would have to proactively put out on a public website all details of their income and expenditure on a monthly basis, or at least on a quarterly basis. Secondly, all income and expenditure of candidates as well as political parties would have to be through banking channels. No candidate or political party will be allowed to spend anything in cash. Everything has to be through banking channels. Thirdly, there has to be a limit fixed for expenditure by political parties, and those laws about anonymous funding through electoral bonds or unlimited funding by corporations, etc., that those have to be repealed. There have to be a limit to the amount of donations that corporations can give to political parties. Then, of course, there needs to be, I agree with Professor Gowda, there needs to be state funding of elections so that there is a more level playing field in elections. The enforcement machinery has to be revamped. Enforcement is done at two levels. One is at the level of the Election Commission. One problem today, you see, for many years, the Election Commission in India was supposed to be an independent institution. But recently, especially during the BJP regime, we have seen the complete suborning of the Election Commission, and we have seen election commissioners all being brought in from Gujarat and acting in a totally partisan way. So we need to revamp the government alone controls the selection of election commissioners. This law must be changed. In fact, we have gone to court against this. We have asked for that matter is still pending in the Supreme Court, that there needs to be an independent selection committee. One model could be the Prime Minister, the Leader of Opposition, and the Chief Justice. But in my view, there needs to be a more broad-based independent committee to select election commissioners. Secondly, there is a problem at the level of the courts also, though the law says that election petitions have to be decided within 6 months. But unfortunately, they are not even decided within 5 years. By and large, election petitions keep pending until the next election takes place, rendering them infructuous. So therefore, we need to set this right. We need to set our judicial system right to ensure that indeed election petitions and disqualification of candidates on the ground of corrupt practices, etc., are in fact decided within 6 months, as the law indeed provides. So, therefore, these are, in my view, a few changes. I mean, I'm not giving a very sort of comprehensive talk. Khushbu gave a very, very good, very comprehensive talk about all the gamuts of political funding. And as I
Okay.
said, I greatly benefited from hearing her. So I think I'll stop here.